out by really thanking Deb, other organizers, and sponsors of this event. I think, well, CSA is extremely happy to be part of the ACT agenda, and obviously I think just from the discussions that I've borne witness to today, a lot of productive stuff's coming out of here. Delta is already going to go and change some of their policies, so anyhow, good group of people, and actually Deb, want to compliment you on your choice of topics, because I think all the presentations seem to fit very well together. Just one one little disclaimer. I am going to be working very much in the adaptation area at the Canadian Standards Association. I just started weeks ago. Michel Girard is the director of climate change at the Canadian Standards Association, and he was not able to make it today. I'm giving a talk that he was going to give, and I'm more or less up to speed on it. So hence I have a lectern, and I'll be probably making more use of notes than I would have otherwise. But basically, over the next 25 minutes or so, first of all, I'll give a quick introduction to the Canadian Standards Association for those of you who are familiar with it, and kind of outline our main lines of business, and especially in relation to climate change. Then I'll go into a discussion of general implications of climate change for codes, standards, and related instruments, and I use CSRI as a shorthand for that. And just to be clear, by CSRI, I'm talking about mechanisms that provide guidance relating to normative aspects of planning, designing, building, managing infrastructure. So with CSRI, we're not talking just about codes and standards, it's also about other things such as guidelines, best practices, master specs, instruments like that. The next part of the presentation I'd like to use to present the results of a national survey that CSA carried out, I think a little bit over a year ago. And it basically, what I want to do with this is underscore what we see at the CSA as a clear need among infrastructure professionals and their organizations for assistance in adapting their practices in light of the changing climate. And finally, the final two bullets there, I'll be talking about the development of a national climate change risk management standard and an associated technical annex. And this is a project that the CSA is very keen to initiate quite soon. And after talking about that a bit, I'll finish up with some concluding remarks. I find that many people, when I first talk to them, are surprised to find out that the Canadian Standards Association is not a government entity, and presumably this is because the word standards probably conjures up such a dry subject matter that many people presume it can only have to do with government. But the CSA is not a government organization. It's a member-based, not-for-profit organization, independent of government, although we are accredited by the Standards Council of Canada, which is an agency that accredits any body developing national standards for Canada. As you can see, the CSA manages a large number of standards, and the technical committees that are involved in developing and maintaining these standards are made up of CSA members, and they act in their expert capacity and as volunteers in the process. And of course, CSA staff provide the guidance and support along the way. So CSA is becoming increasingly engaged in the area of climate change and has products and services that relate both to things on the adaptation side as well as to mitigation actions. On the adaptation side, I'll of course talk about that stuff in more detail a bit later on, including the National Climate Change Risk Management Standard. On the mitigation side, major area of focus right now is on assisting in the accounting and management of businesses and governments, a lot of provincial governments, GHG emissions reductions and offsets and credits. Before diving into this slide too much, and also because I'm fairly new to the area of standards, I just want to make sure for all those of you who are also new to the area that you realize that when I talk about infrastructure standards, we're talking about basically the set of rules or recommended practices that provide commonly agreed upon specifications for how to design, build, and manage infrastructure. So in essence, standards help to set the bar in terms of the quality of the processes and materials that go into the development and management of infrastructure. And in the end, they're really about human health and safety. So it's fair to say that standards therefore comprise fundamental risk management decisions for society. And as this slide shows, CSA is responsible for over 400 standards linked directly to build infrastructure. The slide there references the various categories. And also important to note that various CSA standards are referenced in, I think around 40% are referenced in federal and provincial legislation. The National Model Building Code itself, for example, has 200 referenced standards in it. So I know this is preaching to the choir, as you're all aware, condition and reliability of different infrastructures and fundamentally their ability to deliver the services for which they're intended really has a strong bearing on quality of life, human safety and well-being, environmental quality, and economic competitiveness in Canada. And this slide is just meant to remind us of that. And actually, it hit me looking at it just a few minutes ago that it's a bit of a mix and match. I think the services and categories of infrastructure are not actually well aligned there. As you also know, climate change is going to increasingly compromise the ability of certain built infrastructure to deliver the level of service that we may wish to assume it able to deliver. And either by way of direct impacts on the structures and services or indirect impacts through changes in human behavior, baseline ecosystem conditions, etc., as other presenters today have already spoken to. So most types of infrastructure are designed in accordance with certain assumptions about the climate and environment in which they'll be operating. And CSRI, or Code Standards and Related Instruments for Infrastructure, rely on climate information in order to determine load factors and tolerance levels. So here, again, think wind intensity, snow loads, duration intensity of rain events, number of freeze-thaw cycles, etc. And as Cameron eloquently addressed before and in a fairly comprehensive fashion, these factors are often referenced in the form of climate design values. So the most, a significant issue then in relation to CSRI is that the climate design values are based on historical assumptions that are not necessarily accurate predictors of future conditions anymore. And of course, we're already seeing for example, multiple 100-year rain events occurring over the course of just a few years in Ontario. In the north, we're seeing record snow loads in places that didn't used to get much snow at all. And all the while, climate data and information are generally increasingly out of date. And this, of course, is the problem here is exacerbated by the fact that climate change has been happening more quickly, especially over the last 15 years. So ultimately, what we need to do is drive towards the revisiting of climate design values and ensure that there's a recalculation of long-term normals that takes into account what's been happening over the last 15 years. Start looking hard at the possibility of using trends analysis, perhaps, in the definition of design values, and also do some hard thinking about how projections of future climate might be pulled into the definition of design values. So just two quick examples. One of where climate design values were inadequate, and then the next will be a positive example. Here, the 1998 ice storm that you're probably familiar with exceeded the design values for various categories of infrastructure. And it was especially problematic for overhead electricity transmission systems, communication towers, and phone lines. It's an emergency that no one had really seen coming. Ice lows are unprecedented, and while standards have since been updated using values based on the 1998 experience, there's still the question that looms of, what might further warming mean in terms of intensity and duration of these types of events. On the flip side, positive example is the Confederation Bridge. Probably many of you are familiar with this example as well, linking PEI to the mainland. And it's held up as a positive example because, in part, they didn't rely on currently available codes and standards. And in fact, innovations developed over the course of the design and construction of this bridge eventually found their way into codes and standards. Also, the designers of the bridge worked very closely with Environment Canada to understand future climate conditions. And while the